All right, hello everybody. So this is a quick recap of exit ticket, clear points, and muddy points from online week 2, which was sampling and replication and generalization. So you can see on the screen here, there are a lot of clear points. I was happy to see that the most common clear points were types of replication and samples versus populations. Those are definitely two of the big things that I was hoping you guys would take away from this week's module. All right, and here are the muddy points. So you'll notice if you're looking at the screen, I put a line toward the bottom there. I'm going to briefly address each of the things that are above the line, but I'm not going to address the ones that are below, and that's because the ones that are below the line, either only one person mentioned them or more than one person mentioned them, but specifically said that they didn't need a video. So I'm just going to address the ones above the line where multiple people mentioned them and or somebody specifically requested a video. All right, so first let's talk about generalization mode versus theory testing mode. So these are two kind of modes that researchers can be in when they're doing research. Any kind of research that you're doing as a psychological researcher could be categorized as either generalization mode or theory testing mode. We've talked before about the idea that external validity is not always important, and that came up in this chapter too. The idea there is that sometimes you want to make a point about generalization. So for example, for our three claim types, frequency, association, and causal claims, frequency claims are always in generalization mode because there's only one variable. They're making a claim about how common that variable is, how often it occurs. And so by default, by definition, with frequency claims, researchers are always in generalization mode because they're trying to say, hey, 72% of the world smiled yesterday, or 65% of people would, obey an experimenter up to the maximum shock in Milgram's study. So with frequency claims, you're always in generalization mode, right? But that's not always the case. So in association claims and causal claims, often researchers are not trying to generalize findings. They're just trying to find out if something exists, if some psychological effect is real. So for example, does intoxication cause aggression, right? That's an example we've used before. Hello, here's my cat. So that kind of an idea, does intoxication cause aggression? Researchers are trying to figure out, is there a link at all? They're just trying to test the theory, right? Think back to the theory data cycle. They're trying to find out whether there is a link between those two variables. When you're just trying to find out if some kind of a link exists at all, then in that case, external validity is not that important. You don't need to know if it applies to everybody. You have to find out first, does it exist at all? A lot of the research that we do in psychology is initially in theory testing mode. We're just trying to figure out, is there some psychological effect? Does one variable affect another? Is one variable linked to another? Those are you might think of those as being basic questions. Does something exist? Is there something there? Often it's not until later that researchers switch to generalization mode once they're pretty sure that they've got that theory down, right, that they know that that causal link exists, or they know that that association link exists. Once researchers are pretty sure that they've got that down, then they might switch to generalization mode and say, okay, I know this is a thing, but does this apply to a lot of other people? Is it just happening in my sample, or does it apply to everybody in the US, or does it apply to all college students, or does it apply to all young adults, right? That's when you switch to generalization mode and try to figure out for whom is this finding true and for whom is it not. We talked about, or rather you read about in the book, that cultural psychology is always in generalization mode. If you're in cultural psych, you probably already have seen this, but the idea is that researchers were in theory testing mode, studying whether theories were true or not with weird samples, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, like in the US. And then cultural psychologists say, okay, cool, that exists for, Americans or Europeans, but does it exist for everybody in the same way? And that's what cultural psychology is all about. All right, so hopefully that helps. You could think about this as being theory testing mode is saying, does something happen? Is some psych effect real? Generalization mode is saying, okay, it's real, but who does it apply to? And maybe who does it not apply to? So often theory testing mode comes first with association or causal claims. Once researchers have got that theory down, then they switch to generalization mode to try to figure out who does that apply to. So it's just two different kind of approaches to doing research. All right. Secondly, how does replication test external validity? So external validity is usually about the sample, right? We talked in the slides PowerPoint about how external validity is about how you got your sample, not how many people are in your sample. How many people is a statistical validity question. It affects the margin of error of an estimate. So how many is a statistical question, but how you got your sample, that's an external validity question. So replication, what replication does, all three types of replication, they test that original finding, like say the original Milgram finding. They test it with a new set of participants. Because even a direct replication where everything is exactly the same measurement, same procedure, everything's the same, there's one thing that won't be the same, and that's the participants. Because when you're doing a replication, you're going to be trying it with new participants, not with the ones that were in the original study. So we saw that with the Dolinsky et al. Article, right, that we read for last week's module. They changed other things too. It wasn't a direct replication, as you saw. But even so, right, one big difference was the participants. And you're trying to figure out, do those results hold up? So whenever you're doing any kind of replication, you're asking, hey, does this hold up with a new set of participants? Maybe with a new variable operationalization and a conceptual replication, maybe with the addition of a new variable we're interested in, a replication with extension, right? With replication, you're asking, do these findings hold up when we test them again? So you're trying to figure out, does it hold up? That ends up being an external validity question. Not just how you got your sample, but does it hold up with a new sample as well? All right, the third thing here is a couple people mentioned having trouble with random sampling versus random assignment. So they both sound similar, right? They both have to do with your participants. They both have the word random in them, but they serve different purposes. Random sampling comes first. That is when you are obtaining your sample for your research study. So random sampling is about how are you getting that sample, right? We talked about external validity. It's how you got your sample, not how many that matters. That's a random sampling question. So did you use one of those types of probability sampling? That's a random sampling question, right? Or did you not, right? Did you just take a convenient sample, like just the people who are in, I don't know, your methods class, right? And you poll them on something. Excuse me, that would be not a random sample. It's not representing the population well. It's a biased sample. So random sampling is about how you get your participants into the study. Random assignment is specific to experiments where you need to have people in different conditions of your study. We'll talk about experiments not this week. This week is the take-home exam, but next week we're going to start talking about experimental design. Random assignment is where you're taking the participants that you already have in your sample, so you already sampled them, they're already in your study, now you're randomly putting them in conditions. So if I'm doing that intoxication and aggression study and I'm going to have some people drink no beers, some people drink 2 beers, some people drink 4 beers. Random assignment, once I already have my sample, I'm going to randomly choose who's going to get no beers, who's going to get 2 beers, who's going to get 4 beers. And I have to do that randomly. I can't say, hey guys, hey participants, how many beers do you want to drink? That would be them self-selecting which condition. That creates an internal validity problem. We'll talk more about that next week. But random assignment, right? You already have your sample. You're putting them into conditions in your experiment. So random sampling, how are you getting your sample in the first place? That comes first. After you already have your sample, if you're doing an experiment, then you do random assignment to put them into different conditions. One thing I'll mention, if you're still finding this distinction a little bit tricky, it'll probably make more sense after we get into the stuff on experimental design next week, not this week, but next week. So hold on to that as we talk more about the importance of random assignment, internal validity for experiments. I think that'll help become a little clearer. All right, the next question was, what is a meta-analysis? This is a good question. I really just included this idea of meta-analysis in the homework because it was already in the textbook chapter and because it is an important part of psychological science. But I'll say right away, you don't need to be that concerned about what meta-analysis is for this class. So don't, worry about that in terms of like exams for this class. But generally what a meta-analysis does, instead of a regular research project, we have a research question, we design a study, we test that question, we see if our results support our hypothesis, right? That's the usual procedure. That's what's been going on in all the articles you've read for this class so far. But with meta-analysis, they're doing a little bit different. In meta-analysis, the researcher is not testing a new question. They're not coming up with their own sample and their own operationalizations. With a meta-analysis instead, what the researcher does is they gather all of the existing research on some topic, and then they see, okay, out of all of this research, what's the overall trend? So if I'm a researcher, if I'm trying to figure out, what the overall effect of intoxication on aggression is, instead of designing my own new study for a meta-analysis, instead of designing my own new study, what I would do is I would go survey the research literature and I would see how many studies are already out there that address this link. So maybe there's, I don't know, 5 different studies that already look at this. And so I gather all of those studies and I statistically average out the effects of those 5 studies, and I look and see what's the overall trend. This might be where you guys are getting confused. You don't need to worry about how meta-analysis works. You might learn more about it in Methods 2 or in your advanced courses in the major, but just kind of think about meta-analysis as being how we take stock of what's going on. So what's the overall trend in a certain research question. Basically, just keep in mind that in meta-analysis, as a researcher, you're not doing your own original study. Instead, you're assessing all of the existing studies and seeing, okay, overall, what's going on here. All right, hopefully that helped. But again, meta-analysis is a bit of an advanced topic. You don't need to worry too much about it. I just wanted to kind of put it out there so you guys know that it's something that exists in case you see it again later in other parts of your psych degree. Okay, next up, when to use each type of replication. This is a great question, right? We've got those 3 types of replication. Direct, where everything is exactly the same except the participants, but everything else is just exactly the same. We have conceptual replication, same research question, but you maybe try out a new operationalization to see if it holds up with that new operationalization of a measurement. And then replication plus extension, same basic research question, but adding an additional variable, something new that wasn't tested in the original. That would be like the Delinsky study, where they added the learner gender as a new question that wasn't tested in Milgram's original work. So the question here is, when do you use each type? The answer is, it's a judgment call. You guys are probably getting tired of hearing that by now, but a lot of research is judgment calls. We, as researchers, we make informed decisions based on our knowledge of the field and on how things work. That's why you're taking 2 methods classes in your psych degree, so that you can have a basis from which you can start to make those decisions. But it's a judgment call, right, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. If you read about some study and you're like, wow, I can't believe they got those findings, I'm not sure if I believe that, you might do a direct replication. Do exactly what that researcher did, see if you get the same thing. That's just like a quick check. Well, not that quick, you have to do all the data collection and stuff, but it's just like a little check of, is that really, did they really find that, or something fishy going on there? We talked about replication crisis, right? So a direct replication is like a check of, okay, if I do things exactly the same way as that other researcher, would I get the same finding? Conceptual replication is a little different of a purpose for that, I would say. A lot of researchers do conceptual replications in their research. We talked in the slides about how papers that have multiple studies in them, which you'll read a couple of those in the coming weeks, they typically have conceptual replication built in, or replication plus extension built in. They do one study that tests some finding. They say, okay, cool, I got something neat there. They do a second study that maybe tries it with a new operationalization to see if it holds up. That's conceptual replication. Or maybe adds a new variable to the same basic research question. That's replication plus extension. So with either of those 2 types, conceptual or replication plus extension, the researcher's goal is typically to say, okay, cool, I got that once. Can I get that again with a different variable measurement or with a new variable added that I want to know more about? It's kind of like a sanity check on your own research of saying, okay, I got that once, will I get it again? Without necessarily doing a direct replication, right? But instead adding something new, so that even though you're still replicating the finding, you're also adding something new to test as well. I would say for this class, I'm not that worried if you know when to use each type of replication, because again, it's a judgment call based on what your goal is. But just, I would say, make sure you understand the differences between those 3 types of replication. All right, I did have a couple people mention that the module activities were tough, and somebody specifically mentioned having trouble still adapting to online learning. I'm still sort of thinking of some ideas for this. I was expecting that this week's modules would be easier, more straightforward, but it's that's too bad if people are still struggling with them. So as you are taking your take-home exam this week, I'm going to think about some options for this, and maybe I'll send you guys an email toward the end of this week with some ideas for this. All right, so if you, in the meantime, have any ideas for, how to make those module activities clear, definitely email me. But otherwise, I'll be in touch again about this soon. All right, and then a couple people, just one person mentioned each of these, but specifically requested a video. One person mentioned probability sampling is tough. I'm not quite sure what was confusing about probability sampling for this person, but I know from last semester I had some students who found it tricky to distinguish those 5 types of probability sampling that were from the textbook. So in your homework you answered, you just explained 2 of the 5. If that's what's confusing, don't worry. I'm not going to ask you in exams to distinguish the 5 different types of probability sampling. That's not what I'm doing. Instead, just know, generally what probability sampling is, why we want to do it, why we want to have random sampling, because we want it to give us a representative sample. So that's what I recommend. That should be your takeaway about probability sampling. Ideally, we want to do probability sampling because we want to have a representative sample, because having a representative sample increases our external validity. So that's what I would say I want you guys to take away from that. All right, next up, somebody requested a video because they were having trouble with the statistics in the article. The answer for this one is really simple. I really don't care if you guys get the stats for the articles in this class. I know that might feel a little unsatisfying, but the reason I don't care about that for this class is because a lot of you are in stats at the same time as you're taking methods, so you might not have learned about the specific tests that are in a given article until after we've already read it in this class. And some people haven't taken stats at all yet, because you can take methods 1 before you take stats. So some of you are probably in that position as well. That's why I'm not requiring anything about the stats in the article. I don't, really care if you understand them. I don't want to spend a lot of time in class on the stats in the articles. And that's because people don't necessarily have the same level of preparedness in order to understand them. So I would say, as you're reading the articles, if you're reading the results section and you're like, oh, hey, I know what that means, that's awesome. Especially if you're in stats right now or you've already taken stats, give it a shot. See if you understand the stats. Definitely go for that. But if you haven't taken stats yet, don't worry about it. There's plenty of time later in your degree for you to learn more about reading stats in articles specifically. So hopefully that helps. As far as understanding the stats in articles, it's just optional right now. If you're not getting it, don't worry about it. All right, and then lastly, somebody requested me to address this in the video, questions to interrogate the 4 validities. I think in last week's module, one of the activities was about this, and I posted the key to last week's modules with some examples of questions to ask for the 4 validities. So definitely take a look at that if you haven't already. But what I would recommend, if you're thinking about questions to ask about the 4 validities, just think about questions that would address those 4 validities and think about whether they would make sense, to ask those questions for a particular study that you're reading, a particular article that you're reading. And that goes back to understanding what those 4 validities are about, right? So if you're thinking about the 4 validities, you've got internal, external, statistical construct. If we were to start with construct validity, because we finished up our chapter on variable measurements last week, right? Construct validity is about, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? So questions that would ask you about construct validity are things like, is this a good operationalization of their variable? Does their variable measurement, does it have good reliability? Does it have good validity according to those 5 subtypes of validity? Things like that. So it's just asking, is this a good variable measurement? Statistical validity, that's a bit beyond the scope of this class, but you are basically asking, do the results make sense? Does the data hold up? This could be questions like, did the researcher use the appropriate statistical test to test their question? Or what's the strength of the correlation? Or what's the margin of error of the percentage? That kind of stuff. How to determine which question is appropriate, especially for statistical validity, is a bit, a little more advanced in this class because it requires you to have taken stats already. So don't worry too much about statistical validity. And then internal, external, right? Internal validity, we're going to talk more about that, not this week, but next week when we start experimental design. But internal validity, that's questions like those 3 causal criteria, right? For a causal claim. Is there temporal precedence? So did the IV come before the DV? Is there an association? Is there covariance, right? Are the 2 variables related to each other? If they're not related, they can't be causally related, right? And then that's your internal validity question. Is there something else, some alternate explanation that could explain these results other than the causal X causes Y? Remember, internal validity is really only relevant for causal claims and experiments. You can ask internal validity questions for association claims and correlations, but it's you kind of know with correlations that you don't have good internal validity. And then lastly, external validity, that was this week, right? Sampling. So external validity, that's where you're asking about how did you get your sample. Remember, it's how you got your sample, not how many people in your sample that matters. So how did you get your sample? Did you use random sampling, right? Did you use probability sampling, or was it a convenience sample? Those are the kind of questions you can ask for external validity. All right, so hopefully that was helpful for you guys. If you have any other questions or would like me to clarify anything else in more detail, just shoot me an email. And that'll do it for this week. Again, let me know if you have any questions about anything.